Hey everyone, it's Christian, Vancouver Realtor, and I want to talk to you today about several topics in the news that got my attention, and I want to share it with you because you as a homeowner may just want to stay in the know. And so the first topic I want to look at is immigration backlog. You may have heard about this, but Canada's backlog is now 2.7 million people who are waiting for their citizenship and waiting for their PR. Now think about that, 2.7 million people, that's more than all of Atlantic Canada. So there's an Atlantic Canada worth of people right now in the backlog. It's the biggest and longest backlog in the history of the country. Now, why is this important? Why does it matter? Well, a lot of the people who become permanent residents will go on to buy real estate. And from my own research, I found, according to census data, that about 50% of people will buy within the first 3 years of getting their PR status. And of that backlog, the numbers here say that 522,000 are waiting for their permanent residency status. Wow. So that's 500,000 people right there. That's a big city worth of people waiting to get their PR, and half of them are going to pull the trigger on a place. So just in case you were wondering about the long-term health of the real estate market with interest rates going up and slowing conditions, just know there's 250,000 buyers there coming down the pipe, and they're going to be obviously looking for their own place. You know, there was an interesting story in one of the articles about this Pakistani guy who has been waiting for his PR. And he, in 2020, he applied and he was told by Immigration Canada, hey, you'll have an answer in 6 months. Don't worry. Well, here he is 2 years later and he's still waiting for a response. Pretty rough on someone like that. Obviously, I presume it's going to affect his ability to get employment when you don't know what your status is. And well, you can just imagine with all these people how it affects them on a personal level as well. Moving along, we have the home equity tax. Okay, so I was scrolling online reading some news, and this ad popped up on my screen, and I thought, what is this? A home equity tax? I looked a little closer, and I saw there was an ad by the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, which is kind of like a watchdog, watching the government, making sure that they're not hiking your taxes, dear viewer, or mine, unjustifiably, and just making sure the government runs the budget in a proper fashion. And so they had this ad, which in essence is saying that the government is noodling the idea of a home equity tax. And when I mean the government, I really mean the CMHC, which is the Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation, and that's kind of an arm's length branch of the federal government, but an independent body. And so they had this, the story goes that they had commissioned a study to look into this home equity tax. And now the CMHC head at the time, this is 2 years ago, he vehemently denied this. He said, no, it's not true, don't believe it. Yet we see these articles come out which say that a possible home equity tax for Canadians is still being floated. Hey, where there's smoke, there's usually fire. And so I can see why the guy would want to keep it under the wraps. This would be a political hot potato. No federal government is going to want to introduce a tax like this. I mean, the last time we saw something like this was when the Conservatives in 1992-93 brought in the GST. Remember that? Well, I'm old enough to remember that as a little kid, but still, it was very unpopular, and the next time they went to the polls in 1993, they got slaughtered. And it was the biggest defeat a federal governing party has ever had at the polls. I think they went into the election with something like 150 seats, and they got smoked. They were reduced to two seats. and they never recovered. It wasn't until about 15 years later that they got back into government. So a federal party is not going to want to introduce this tax, but they're kind of secretly discussing this. And so this guy who was the former CMHC head has moved on, but he didn't want this to get out into the public. The numbers they were discussing were a 0.2 to a 1% tax on the value of your home if it's over $1 million. So for example, let's say you or your parents, you bought a home 20 years ago, it's now over $1 million, and you go to sell it. And you make $1 million, so principal gains capital gains exemption here means that you get to keep all of that. That's the one bone the Canadian taxman will throw you. You get $1 million. Now, the way this would apply, if they applied a 1% tax on the last 20 years at $1 million, you could be looking at a $200,000 tax. Now, I'm not sure if that's exactly the number they have if that's how they would apply it, but that is how I understand it. That's a heck of a tax. So this would be very unpopular. Just keep an eye out on this. And the government is probably going to look at raising revenue at some point. They're going to need to. I mean, if you looked at our fiscal deficit for last year, you probably noticed that with the CERB payments and all the government handouts, that the federal government ran a whopping $343 billion deficit, which is more than looks like the last 10 years combined. And so they're going to need tax revenue, and they're going to be trying to noodle every which way they can get their hands in your pocket. So you better cover your pockets. They may be coming. Now, I'm sure they mean well, and one of in these sort of, I guess the Canadian Taxpayers Federation was able to uncover these emails that were sent back and forth between folks at the CMHC and the people who are running this study. Researchers implied current homeowners haven't earned the rise in their homes' values, which they insist occurs, quote, while they sleep and watch TV. End quote. Now that's a pretty ballsy statement. So they're saying that you as the homeowner, whether you took 5 or 10 years to save up that down payment for your home, you kind of don't deserve the run-up in home values that comes after you've lived there for 10, 20 years. I don't know if I agree with that. I think that's that's kind of hitting below the belt, if you ask me. It's very hard to save up for a down payment in a big city like Vancouver or in Toronto. And so when you're doing that, it's an accomplishment. It really is. And if you've gotten to the point where your home value's over $1 million here in the Lower Mainland or even in Toronto, I got news for you. That's not a whole lot of money these days. Maybe 30 years ago it was. $1 million doesn't buy you a detached house in Vancouver anymore, or in Burnaby, for example. So just keep an eye on this. I'm going to sign that petition. I definitely do not want the government, any government, I don't care who it is, coming out with a home equity tax. And so I'm going to be signing that petition. I suggest you do as well. It's pretty easy to find. Just Google it. You'll land on their page. Moving along, other changes in real estate that you may want to know about. HELOCs, home equity lines of credit. There's been a change. This one's kind of flown under the radar. Not too many people are aware of it, but the governing body that oversees this has decided to limit the amount of money you can take out of your home equity line of credit to 65% of the value of the home when you bought it. So it used to be 80%. And so, for example, if you bought a home for $1 million and you had paid off so the way it works is if you paid off $1,000 of your principal for a home equity line of credit, the next month you have $1,000 available that you can take out and you can use towards, whatever you want to use it. The smart thing would be to use it towards a home renovation to improve the value of your home. You don't want to be taking that money out for frivolous things like vacations or even buying cars. Car is a depreciating asset. You do not want to be paying long-term interest on a depreciating asset. Now, when it comes to this, it's just a conservative measure. It's kind of like a safeguard, making sure that people don't use their homes as ATM machines. So from that point of view, I think it's a good idea. So, and you can't go up to 80% or let's say $800,000 of $1 million home. You could only pull out $650,000 if you had paid off all of your mortgage. Visually, just so that you can see what that looks like, the green line there represents your mortgage being paid off over a number of years, and the blue line here represents the home equity line of credit. In this case, the person is taking out more and more. Now, the danger with something like this is that people will run up too much debt on their homes, and they get to the point where they're paying interest only. So in my research, I found that only 1 in 1,000 HELOC users has actually run into some kind of credit issues and was looking at a default. That's pretty low. So not to worry about you folks who are worried about a crash in the housing market because people have HELOCs out on their home. That's a really low number. Only 6% of users had maxed their HELOC. Still pretty low. And 90% of people are avoiding the interest-only trap. So fairly good numbers there. I'm not too worried about the HELOC because it's based on a variable interest rate. Obviously, as that interest rate goes up, so do your HELOC payments. So far, I would not expect this to cause too much of an issue for the overall Canadian housing market. Okay? All right, last thing, and just a couple of comments about this online. There was an article in the Globe and Mail from one of their financial guys. He talked about 40-year amortization periods, and that this would be a great way to make homes more affordable. It would be a solution to high home prices. They already have this in Britain. I guess they've introduced this a couple of years ago because in Britain, cities like London, home prices are insanely expensive. It's kind of Vancouver, New York level expensive. And so to give people a break, they give them longer to pay off that mortgage principal. What it means is that your monthly payment will get reduced. And so this would be a huge hand to people in big markets like Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, who are having trouble getting into a home, and where the monthly mortgage payments are just so high. So I think this is a really smart move. Now, the criticism of this would be that people are going to be in debt longer, and that people may overextend themselves by buying more than they really can afford. Well, just like we did with the stress test, there's no reason why the government couldn't tweak this and say, look, you can apply for a 40-year amortization, but you've got to show that you can qualify under a 30-year amortization. So I think that would be pretty straightforward. And we used to have a 35-year amortization period here, but they knocked that down about 11 years ago. So just something to think about. In terms of real dollars, if you had a $700,000 mortgage at just below 5% interest rate, the difference between a 25 and a 30-year amortization is a little over $300. So it makes a difference. It can help a lot of people. Okay, so that's just a few comments on what's going on in the real estate industry, some news that you may want to be informed about. If you like the video, give us a thumbs up. If you do not like the video, give us a thumbs down and maybe tell us why. So appreciate you watching, and we'll see you next time.